The leaders of President Obama's bipartisan commission to tackle the federal debt problem are meeting this week. Now, we have about $12.8 trillion of debt, according to the debt clock that we like to show. But did you know that even as our debt balance rises, our interest payments are lower than they were a year ago? You may say, how is that? Here's how. Our interest rates are lower. In fact, the U.S. government paid a higher percentage of its GDP on debt payments a decade ago when President Clinton was in office, and we actually had a budget surplus. Well, doesn't that make the case for not caring about all this borrowing? It's a pretty stunning statistic. Are fears about the debt crisis overblown? James Galbraith is an economics professor at the University of Texas. Peter Schiff is the president of Euro-Pacific Capital, also running for Senator Chris Dodd's seat in the state of Connecticut. These two gentlemen feel passionately and differently on this issue. Professor Galbraith, let me start with you. This statistic was pretty stunning. When I saw it, I was eager to do this segment. All this fear about debt, is it fear-mongering?
It is fear-mongering, and thank you for noticing that interest rates were much higher a decade ago than they are today. The United States government does not have and is not going to have a problem financing its public expenditures and its deficits. It's simply not an issue that should be on our list of things that we really care about right now.
Peter Schiff.
Well, you can see that I'm laughing. Well, basically, the reason that this is happening, it's not magic. The U.S. government is making the same mistakes that subprime borrowers did when they were using teaser rates on their mortgages. We have a $12.5 trillion debt, as you state. First of all, that doesn't include any of the off-budget items like the debt of Fannie and Freddie, and it certainly doesn't include the unfunded liabilities, which dwarf that number. But if you just take the funded debt and you look at where it's going to be in a year or two, it'll be around $15 trillion. What happens if interest rates go up to 10%? Which is half of where they were in 1980. All of a sudden, we're paying $1.5 trillion a year in interest on the national debt. You see, the term on the national debt, the maturity is very short. The government is not borrowing for 30 years. The government is borrowing for 30 days. There's a lot of short-term paper. This is a teaser rate on an adjustable rate mortgage, and we are headed for disaster.
Now he makes a case there, Professor Galbraith. What's your response to that, likening it to a subprime mortgage and fairly pointing out a lot of this debt is short-term borrowing? It's got to be rolled over.
Yes, but the government can, in fact, borrow for 20 years at a rate which is now running at 4.5%.
No, not if it tried to do it. If it actually tried to do it, rates would go up.
Well, that's a rate which tells you that the capital markets are not, in fact, worried about this, whatever this actual scenario is, that somehow the capital markets are going to turn around and say that the U.S. government cannot finance itself.
The only reason,
of course, it should finance itself. If it can finance itself for the short term at zero, it should do so.
No,
perfectly reasonable thing to do.
The reason that the federal government isn't borrowing in the 30-year bond market is if it tried to refinance the short-term debt long-term, it would destroy the bond market. Bond prices would collapse and interest rates would go through the roof. The only reason long-term rates are so low is because the government isn't borrowing at the long end.
Peter, what about the question, though, that part of this comes down to there is a pool of money out there and it wants to go somewhere it perceives to be safe. So the U.S. may have a problem, but I mean, look, Greece has been in default half the years it's been in existence. Spain, Portugal, you name it. I mean, the U.S. may be bad, but it may be better than anywhere else, and maybe that's why rates are low.
Greece didn't have it. Nobody was talking about Greece's problem 6 months ago. All of a sudden, it's a problem. The United States is the next Greece. We're going up the food chain in sovereign credit. We are the worst offenders. We owe the most amount of money to the most amount of people all around the world. We have this giant credit bubble, and when it began to burst in 2008, we didn't solve the problem. We made it worse. We have a much bigger problem coming in the years ahead when the U.S. government bubble bursts.
The difference between the United States and Greece is that Greece is a member of the euro, and Greece has to fund itself in a currency that it cannot control. The United States is in full control of its own currency.
But that's the bigger problem.
We can have some problems. I'm not just saying that we are free, we've solved all economic problems. I'm saying financing the government of the United States is not one of the problems that we face.
Sure it is. See, the fact that Greece can't print money, that's a good thing. The fact that we can print money to repudiate our debts with inflation, that's not a good thing. Anybody who's holding U.S. government bonds, basically what you're saying is, it's okay, the government's going to print a bunch of money, you're going to get paid.
If the markets were seriously worried about the prospect of inflation, they would not have a 4.5% rate on 20% bonds.
The markets are wrong. Look, just like the markets didn't see the subprime problem until it was too late. Look, gold is at $1,100 an ounce for a reason. It didn't go from 250, 10 years ago to 1,100, 1,200 without people worrying about inflation.
Since 1980, we go to that problem. It doesn't look so good.
So you're telling me that this is all tied to the price of gold is the oracle that we should be following on this?
You should be following something. Don't be following the Federal Reserve. To say that because interest rates aren't high, the market has consistently gotten things wrong. I was on this network, CNBC, back in 2005 and 2006. Warning about the housing bubble, the collapse that was coming, the problems in Freddie and Fannie, the problems with the financials. No one believed it. People were laughing it off. Right. All of a sudden, these things happen.
That if the markets truly are as inefficient and irrational as you say, then we should tax them and we should regulate them to a fairly
level. Well, they're already taxed and regulated. That's part of the problem.
Let's take a pause there. And viewers, let us know. Is this a case of we should be concerned about it, or is this perhaps proof, if you trust markets, that the U.S. should continue to borrow as long as rates are low? Let us know what you think. StreetSigns@CNBC.com. We'll bring back both the esteemed gentlemen on our panel to continue talking about it. Maybe it's just a case of, hey, if you owe $1 to the bank, it owns you, but if it's $100 million, you own them.